So, good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you had an enjoyable Easter. Hopefully had an opportunity to get out on the bike to work off some of those excess calories that were no doubt consumed over the weekend. And what a bizarre weekend for weather. Sunburnt on Sunday and dodging the snow on Monday. Anyway, hope you managed to catch the Tour of Flanders. If you haven't, what a cracking race that was. So it's definitely one to find on the video channels if you haven't seen it. Anyway, this evening I am delighted to welcome Scott Gardner, or Dr Scott Gardner if we're being formal. Scott is joining us from somewhere in Tasmania, having successfully navigated lockdown and closed state borders in Queensland. So a huge thank you to Scott. Who I know has the espressos lined up. I think he's probably nipped off to get an espresso now, as it's 4 a.m. I'll say that again, 4 a.m. on Wednesday morning for him, and he's just arrived. There he is on cue with his new espresso. So we'll be gentle with you, Scott. To be honest, I think we both cocked up here. We both forgot the clocks were changing. So what seemed to be quite a sociable 11-hour time difference suddenly became 9 hours. And we did have a discussion very early this morning, UK time, as to whether he was going to pull an all-nighter or whether he was going to rely on the caffeine this morning. Anyway, hot fire on any judgment, Scott, to see how you perform.
Thank you, Chris. I will own my own performance today and say that I messed up with the time zone changes and that we really got the daylight savings well.
It was me, mate. Don't worry. Anyway, in terms of high performance and high performance sporting achievement, few Tasmanians have probably been as successful as Scott. And I have to say, as a Brit, I probably struggle to name more than 2 or 3 successful Tasmanians. I have done my research, Scott, you'll be pleased to know.
There's two straight to the Errol Flynn, yes.
Errol Flynn.
Same school.
Not sure he's a sportsman, but Ricky Ponting, David Boone, who I think is probably more famous for his beer drinking capacity than his cricket.
Oh, he did hit the winning runs in the Ashes back in about.
Yeah, we're moving on. Anyway, there's a certain Richie Port who I'm sure we'll talk about shortly in a minute. Anyway, given his action-packed career that has involved multiple Olympic Games and World Championships around the world, I'm sure it's only a matter of time before Scott himself is added to the list of famous Tasmanians. Scott, on a serious note, Scott is a world-leading pioneer in sports science, having honed his skills across multiple sports, and we'll probably talk about some of them, working with a number of countries around the world. Probably his highest profile successes have no doubt come with GB cycling, with the likes of Chris Hoy, Jason Kenny and Victoria Pendleton. He has in the past worked with the Aussie stars Anna Mears and Shane Kelly. That was before he came over and found success in the UK.
Olympic champion Ryan Bailey.
I was holding that one in reserve, Scott, holding it in reserve.
AFC kid.
He's also been involved in GB National Swimming Squad and the GB canoeing programme, despite, and we'll check this later, but apparently, rumour has it, you've never actually been in the K1, but we'll come back to that. So, Richard, good evening and welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
Do we have some exciting news of this evening's draw?
We've got some more Lecole socks, kindly donated by Yamto, who was our speaker last week. I was delighted to receive a bundle of goodies from him, and we'll be promoting Lecole on our webinar series as we go forward. And we will, at the end of the webinar, just mention the rides that are now firmly in the diary, COVID permitting. So time to get together in real life.
Good, looking forward to it. Thanks, Richard. Now, I think people probably know the routine by now, this being our 7th webinar, but if you do have any questions, I'm sure there'll be loads of questions flying in, not least how Scott managed to look so good at 4 o'clock in the morning. But if you've got any questions, drop them into the Q&A and Richard and I will pick them up as we go. So, Scott, tell us where the sun is rising on you this morning. what are your plans, and what about these rumours that you're actually moving away from sport, going into cherry farm?
Right. So seriously, looking good at 4 o'clock in the morning. Look at my hair.
Bad
Are
head.
you kidding yourself? It's like, so the last time I saw my other half during this pandemic, my hair was all nice like yours, Chris. So that's how much your hair grows in my hair grows in a year.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Last time I saw my other half, and we got terrible news last night. As I try to become a cherry, should we say a stone fruit farmer? Is that such a thing? No, cherries mainly. I am in Tasmania at the bottom of Australia. Came down here last March to escape a teen lockdown. I was skiing in France. Katie and I were up there and got to Australia. Didn't know what was happening with the Olympics. Sorry, got back to the UK somehow through, shutdowns in Swiss borders, and got back to the UK and made the difficult decision to come to Australia for my work that I do out here with the Malaysian cycling team, and that the Olympics were on still when I left the GB last year. And somewhere along the way, I bought 20 acres, 9-hole chip and putt golf course, 500 fruit trees, and a little cafe right by around about 60 odd Ks of brand new mountain bike trails in St Helens, Tasmania, on the east coast. So,
And that's
I'm living the dream, Chris. Living the dream. I'm just solo. That's the only issue here.
So we've kind of moved right to the end game, but let's drag you back to the beginning. How did you get into sports and sports science in the first place?
I started as a young kid, passionate about sport, Australian rules football, and I wanted to be a physiotherapist. Glad I didn't. I'm really glad I didn't get into that. I didn't have the brains for that. So ended up in sports science at the University of Queensland, and doing at one of those degrees that so many people in the UK do at sort of places like Loughborough and everywhere, which is this sports science, human movement studies, it was called over here. And I moved on quite quickly to the Australian Institute of Sport, where I did my PhD, working with the Australian cycling team, and that was in the lead up to the Athens campaign, which was really quite successful. That's where those Anna Meares, Ryan Bailey gold medals came from. I think Australia won 5 gold medals at that in that Olympics. And I was sitting there with my childhood heroes, John Eales, remember him? John Eales, and then there were 2 other Australians who you might not know quite so much, but Laurie Lawrence, who was a swimming legend down here, and Peter Brock, who was a motor car driver. And I was sitting there as Anna Meares won her gold medal at Athens, thinking, how good is life right at that point? And going back to the Olympic Village after that, it's like, is this the Olympics? You get to hang out with all these cool heroes and you win. It's like amazing. So it was a really successful period of time. Then I finished my PhD and quite quickly got some attention with Dave Brailsford, who wasn't feeling as good, although Britain won 2 gold medals, I think, in Athens. It wasn't bad. Chris Hoy and Bradley Wiggins went quite well, but didn't do as well as they thought. And I think Dave's ambition and drive to be more successful was pretty strong back then. Probably still is quite now.
What was his pitch, Scott? Back in, what was it? Must have been.
Well, he sent others to do it. We were in Bordeaux at the World Track Cycling Championships, and Australia, we'd sent in our B team to the team pursuit. It was probably our C team because we couldn't get our A and B team together 2 years after the Olympics, and we beat. I say we. I didn't do any of this. Like, seriously, these riders do all this. But I was up in the stands watching the Australian B&a-half team beat the British A team in the team pursuit. And I took all the British sports scientists' Easter eggs, because it was Easter. It was actually this period. It was actually this time of year. Took them all Easter eggs, and next thing you know, it was a fairly famous name in British sport. Shane Sutton came up and had a bit of a chat to me, and asked me what I was doing with the next few years of my life. To which I replied, Shane, sorry, mate, you know, I'm Australian, you'd know about this. And yeah, somehow I ended up, I was at a ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine conference, where I was doing a symposium in Denver, Colorado. And I got a very serious phone call, where they asked me to fly. So I flew in, and the first thing off the plane, I was feeling as delirious as I am now. I was in front of Steve Peters getting a psychological interview straight off the flight from Denver, doing laps of the room, trying to work out what I was doing. And next thing you know, I had barely been home, and I was back in the UK. So, and then 15 years of my life.
So how do they make you an offer you can't refuse?
At that stage, I was still on, should we call it, student wages. I'd progressed, I'd done my PhD. There was a big thing here in Australia, which was really quite successful, which was this sort of industry-based scholarships for sport. So because sport was quite underfunded, coming off the back of Sydney Olympics, so we got a whole lot of funding. And then as Sydney, sort of the legacy of Sydney passed, there were people trying to be ambitious and continue the same level of support, knowing that you put people on the front line with new novel ideas, ways to support athletes and coaches, then that can only be successful. So that was the beginning of PhD scholarships within sport, and you'll see a lot of those around the place. They're being run out in all different countries now, but it was Professor Alan Hahn at the Australian Institute of Sport who really was a pioneer in that earlier. And early on, the universities were like, how are we going to do that? We need theses, and we need people to do studies that are, quite insular, and, and to do it on the front line was quite unique. So, I think throughout my PhD, I used probably about 5% of the data I collected throughout my 4 and a bit years on my PhD thesis. I was traveling around the world, working with cyclists and coaches, lucky enough to go to, Athens in that process, but I'd also, started sort of around Sydney time. So,
Scott, what I was going to say, Scott, when you do a transfer like that, clearly money talks. What about the IP? Are you allowed to take any of the IP that they've equipped you with in Australia?
We're scientists, Richard. All the IP is freely available to everybody. There's no secrets at all in anything that we do in sport. It's a great question, and yes, I was able to take all the IP. I actually published a paper which had Australian Olympic champions and British Olympic champions all in the same piece of research, which was quite fascinating. So at that time, Australia was very open, and that's the Australian Institute of Sport really did operate quite. There were some things within the sport that were maybe a little bit more locked up, but it's definitely different now. Okay. If we move ahead in the conversation, what I'm probably allowed to tell you and should tell you and all that about what we're doing with Malaysia, it sort of becomes, once an Olympics is over, we all reset and we'll all sort of share a few more ideas, and then off you go and you head down your own path and dig your own holes and rabbit holes and find your own areas to work in. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I think, one of the companies that I work with now, you know, back then we were all very based inside the institutes, and they were all English Institute and then Australian Institute, and the streams in both areas do their own work, and that's probably a bit more locked up. But there are also a few industry partners around the place, and now you know, I work with a company called Total Sim Vortec. Some of you might be hearing a lot about Vortec. You know, they are making waves. You know, you can go and buy you know, the fastest skin suit on the planet. You can get in the wind tunnel. They bought all the tech kit from Boardman's shutdown tunnel, and so, you know, and some of the staff are now have crossed over. So they're at Silverstone. You can get the best package for a cyclist on the planet from those guys. We just happen to have invested with Malaysia a lot of money as well, to be able to go down an R&D path with them, and we developed the Works Vortec bike, which, you know, I know you've probably got some questions about some horrible looking Lotus piece of, anyway.
You're talking about the Hope bike. And I think there's
the
probably a lot of hope being rested
Lotus bike put into that, you know, but, you know, we are all running an R&D stream, even though UCI rules say that everything should be commercially available. You can buy these bikes.
You could buy the Hope bike if you've got about 26 grand last time I looked.
Yeah, you can buy our Works bike for probably double that, yes.
Can we go back to that coaching role? You land in the UK, you're part of Dave Brailsford's dream team. He's pulling together the best that is available, best talent that is available, and money is no option, seemingly.
Well, it is. There were salary streams, but Dave also had the ability to top those up a little bit.
And what was your role? How were you coaching?
I came in to the team. It's an interesting question, really, because I think Dave really wanted me to be the coach. Like, you know, this is like a pub chat, right? So I'll say it the way it is. I think Dave, and I was a bit more of a sports scientist who had coaching skills and a fascination with coaching and culture and conventional wisdom and why people do things the way that they do them. But I was really at that time still, I'd say that the data man, the data guy, who added, you know, what do we know, what don't we know about the performance? How do we go about achieving what we set out to achieve when we've all agreed it? So at that time I came in, and then two others came in. One came back as coach, which was Ian Dyer, who a lot of you guys might have heard of, as the head sprint coach, and he went on to different roles. Ian came back, and then Jan van Eyden, who was German, call him master tactician or considered master tactician, came in, and sort of we created a tripod for the sprint team. So that was for Sir Chris Hoy, Victoria Pendleton. Jason Kenny was still quite young at that time, but he was coming through the talent teams into the pathway, and he rapidly moved through that to actually be at Beijing in the team sprint and silver medalist in the sprint at that point. But Jamie Staff, Craig McLean, Jason Queerley, Olympic champion, you know, all of these guys were in that, that we were to care for those guys. So, you know, within that team, we all had our own strengths, and I bought data, fact, not opinion, you know, what we set out to achieve, and you know, what's real, what's not real. Ian bought organisation skills. He bought a bunch of stuff around training, riding motorbike, being logistics, all that sort of stuff. He's really strong in that area, really organised. And then Jan bought the flair of track cycling, the experience of track cycling, as being an athlete and a former world champion to boot within that. And he'd get on the track at that stage with Victoria and do tactical efforts, and you know, like it was a real strong trio as we moved towards what was hugely successful in Beijing cycle.
7 golds, was that Beijing?
Well, yeah, there were 7 golds within the sprint team. Chris won 3. So he won the Kieran, the sprint, and the team sprint with Jamie Staff and Jason Kenny, and also Victoria, who only had one opportunity back before there was any form of parity. Victoria beat Anna Mears by straight, pretty much, in the sprint final.
How do you feel about that, having been involved with Anna before?
So I started working with Anna when she was 16 onto the program, about the same in Australia, about the same time Jason Kenny was coming through in that couple of year period there. And first time you pull on the red, white and blue, it's it became very comfortable and it became home, in all honesty. But first time you feel a bit like a traitor, and you feel, but it just becomes about who you work with. Like, becomes the people. It's all about the people. Yeah. And now, I've worked with that many people from other nations that are just fantastic people. And
so, talking about fantastic people, Scott, coming back to the dream team as Richard described it, the obvious question is what was Mr. Brailsford doing when you guys were kind of doing your bits and pieces and making the bits of the jigsaw puzzle come together?
So he was being ambitious, and he was he was stirring the pot, and he has a fascinating outlook on life, and I think you probably find it on some leaders. He's willing to push the rules, the boundaries, the grey zones, the everything. But he had that whole philosophy about triangle of change that you might have seen, things where you need commitment, and he got a group of people together who were seriously committed. You need to then have some sort of psychological awareness about change and development and where you're trying to get to. And then there also is this whole thing about consequences, and he would dial up and down consequences to change, sometimes with carrots to things to achieve. And he put some money on the line at certain points as bonuses and other things for achieving things. But also, when things weren't going in the right direction, he'd also, there was a bit of stick around as well. And, and he'd dial up and down consequences with all of that. And, Shane Sutton was probably one of those consequences along the way. Did I say that? At certain points. But who could give you enough positive praise, love, affection, at the same time as, probably on the other end.
Come back to Brailsford, but Richard, you had a question around financial remuneration, success, and
well, I've got 2 questions really. Going back to somebody like Chris Hoy, did you, when you joined the team, recognise that he had phenomenal potential and therefore worth investing your time and changing your country allegiance?
100%. When I joined, Chris was a kilo rider. He was a time trial rider. He was known for it, and he didn't believe he could win the sprint, or Kieran. And so that came down to a lot of, well, not a lot of work, but when I think Jan and I first suggested it, that wasn't on his radar. He didn't believe that was going to come. So
that's potential. So that's coach-led advice, stroke.
It was coach-led advice. Then the kilo was dropped. Remember, there were, his event had gone. Team sprint was still on the radar for sure as a time trial type event, but from then, I don't think. That was what coach suggested. It was an interesting time. It was a fantastic time back then, because the way that we worked as a trio with those guys, sort of Jan and Ian had their own athletes. I went to all the athletes, and some of these athletes, like at that time, Chris wrote his own training program. So he would bring his training program to us as a team. We'd put it up on the big screen, and we'd work through it with him. So there was full ownership at that point. And it's really powerful if you can get that. So he owned it. It was his IP, if you like, his training program. Every athlete had a different training program. It was a logistics nightmare to run at the track, which is why we needed Ian on top form pretty much every day to be able to make sure. Some days Ross Edgar was on a BMX. It was like, trying to get his leg speed up and do other things. It was fascinating period of time. There's something to be said for it now when so many have gone back to this. It was science-led, coach-driven. It had really progressed at that point. It had so much potential to fly.
Was it fun?
I certainly enjoyed it.
Okay.
Although I lived in Manchester, when you talk about the British weather, I didn't move there for the weather. Some days driving home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was not so certain that that was a good place to be. And when I moved down south to Oxfordshire, I was like, oh shit, it's actually all right, isn't it? Like the weather in the UK is pretty good.
It's snowing here now.
Look upon it as missionary work.
Oh, I remember those Aprils. I can remember a few Aprils where, everything starts growing, the birds start cheeping, and then all of a sudden we've got snow.
It snows. Yeah.
Can
we come back to the science piece? Because I don't know whether you caught it, but we had Dan Bingham on a couple of weeks ago, and he's very, very science focused, and he's got an aerodynamics background. And I have to say that probably the impression you get is that Dan and British cycling are not best of pals. And one of the issues is certainly from his perspective, they don't really want to buy into some of the science that he's sharing with them. So, well, I don't know if you know the background to that, but what do you think's changed? Because it's the sense that British cycling has kind of lost its way a bit over the last few years. Possibly related to your departure, but that's a.
There are a few fantastic people that there are a few fantastic people that are around and or departed over time. Dan Hunt, who's now PD at skiing, Matt Parker, who's now head of research innovation at the EIS. Steve Peters left, Chris Boardman left, the Secret Squirrel Club disbanded, and it took on a whole new path in recent times, and they've done a lot more in-house. So that's when we started working with the Vortec Total Sim guys, because they were involved in the early cycles. And they were a huge part of the Secret Squirrel Club. Rob Lewis and that crew came through, and they just took a different path. So, Tony Purnell runs the R&D program. He's ex-Formula One, but they took a lot more in-house and took their own path to it. I've forgotten the question, Chris, but science-wise, back then we had a rolling resistance rig downstairs in the velodrome. We were using EIS science. I bought a whole bunch of stuff on sprint cycling across and understanding training and periodization and the way that we function performance planning wise. And there's certainly you can look at it in two ways. One, they've kept up. They had a head start on all these things. They've been doing aerodynamic stuff. If we talk about Dan sort of stuff, they've been doing it for a long time. There's since 2004, 5, probably 5 was when it started, and the rest of all the other countries have really only started in the last 5 years.
Yeah, but if you look at what Dan's managed to do with the Denmark team, I mean, that's chalk and cheese, isn't it, in terms of how they progressed relative to GB?
Well, we've still got Ed Clancy in the GB team, so yeah, yes, it's progressed, but I suppose they've learnt from a lot of the GB stuff. And as did probably Dan at certain points, at the same time as, yes, other countries are thinking about it more strategically, better, they're more agile, they're moving quicker. They're trying new things. They've got more of a learning environment. They're not scared to fail, to learn. And, you're seeing that, we got 2 bronze medals with Malaysia at the World Championships with a guy who's seriously, he's like 5 foot nothing. And, we're still not with the Dutch, but, they've got Mehdi Cordy over in Holland, who's working with the Dutch sprint cyclists, another British over there, working with them, he's in a similar area to me. He's done his PhD in a really similar area to me. Just probably the next study that I would have done if I'd stayed at GB, Mehdi ended up doing, and they're going great. So the Dutch are moving really quickly, as are Asian nations now as well, which is so yeah, Dan's doing a fantastic job with those guys, and it really they were at a point where their thirst for hunger for understanding is probably so high, whereas GB probably sit back on, well, we'll bring out our big guns and we'll put our kit on at the right time and we'll see who's boss, I suppose. And that's coming in 3 or 4 months' time. It's going to be a bit of fun.
Well, we'll come on to your predictions for where that's going to end up. But I want to go.
Oh, is that on the cards here? All right, hang on.
Yeah,
right.
You can start making your predictions. But let's take it back a little bit. So you did what we're going to call an initial stint with British cycling, and then moseyed over to swimming. What was the plan there?
The plan was, I fell in love. This is fairly well documented around the place.
So that was a forced move, really, wasn't it? It was because of the conflict of interests and.
Yeah, that was an understanding that once that Olympics was over, that Victoria and I were together, and that there may or may not be a position for me at British Cycling. Yeah. It was well discussed to a degree, and it was the best thing and her worst thing that ever happened to me in my career. And moving across was like, I was no longer, all my science background was in cycling, my research was in cycling, my knowledge, my contacts, everything was in cycling. And to move across to swimming was then a real, what do you know, kid? What skill set are you going to bring over here? And besides a passion for sport, it really allowed me to dig deeper into my processes. And this is where I've gone beyond that into canoeing, into track record coaching in leadership in business, is performance planning and really getting to the nuts and bolts of all these things that I was doing that I didn't really know I was doing, to analyze that. How do we create performance plans for athletes that are outside of conventional norms, that help people to think a little bit differently about their sports? Because we all get so caught up in doing things the way we've always done them, and we find it hard to stop and ask questions of those without them feeling personal or feeling threatening, to then create a new path that is hopefully more successful. But if it's not, that we even learn from trying things to do them a little bit differently.
Is that a benefit, though, going into a sport that you've not had history with? Because you can just challenge.
I remember sitting down with coaches early on going, geez, that cycling sport must be an easy sport, mustn't it? It's like, the thing you don't understand about swimming is it's the hardest sport on the planet. And then they're tough conversations with people.
Yeah.
And it was. Sorry, Richard. Yeah.
No, I was going to let you finish, and then I was going to go back to processes, and we scooted over Brailsford, but I feel you've left something hanging there in terms of.
Oh, have I? Okay.
I think you've left the grey zone open to a further question, so that's where I'm going to go.
I think there's a lot of discussion about grey zones at the moment, so I think So. Yeah, they're tough conversations when you go into a sport, and it's this whole thing about how you go about what you do, you know, or
So I guess
what. So it's the knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviours. And I came into swimming with attitudes and behaviours that were there to explore, with low knowledge and skill. Well, probably had fairly high skills, but pretty low knowledge. You know, and by working through with the attitudes and behaviours was the way to get to the heart of what needed to be done. So
the question I want to ask really is, the process that Brailsford is well known for is marginal gains, and where you find those margins is occasionally in the grey area. And did you find in that environment that it was a healthy dynamic? Were you aware of what was going on? Did you feel there were some things that where you might be crossing the line, or were you all bought into that?
I don't believe that we were back 2008 into 12. I didn't see that grey zone, if that makes sense, if you go into that. Yeah. Marginal gains was something that we talked about. It was a part of what we did. But we really searched for those marginal gains in the key, what I'll call critical elements that are required. So if you try and achieve something in life at anything, there's a critical pathway to achieving it. You said it, they're the things that you have to get right, and without which you'll never achieve what you set out to achieve. And we were good at having those conversations about those critical elements. And within those critical elements, you then sort of pull those apart, and then that's where the marginal gains lie. I think the misnomer of the whole thing was that marginal gains were everywhere, and if you just improve everything in your life by 0.25%, then all of a sudden you'll get this really big gain. We didn't function. I don't believe we functioned that way anyway. I believe they were in key areas. So sleep recovery was a whole part of adaptation to training. There was a whole part around aerodynamics that was really key. There was a whole part around understanding the physiology of the event. And in each of those, there were key marginal gains, and they're prioritised things. They're things that we, you know, through either experience or discussion, decided that these are the areas where we'll focus on to find those gains, and that many gains will add up to a big one in that area. And, you know, which is where you hear the stories of the sleep beds and the recovery things, and you know, the first class flights and all the business class flights and all those things that add up. Yeah. You know, and same with all the parts of the bike back then, and aerodynamics. So I think that they're way more strategic and targeted than maybe the whole thing is got caught up in.
So just following that theme, Scott, I mean, you've referred to Steve Peters a couple of times already. How important a bit of the jigsaw was Steve Peters?
He was a huge part. He was a huge part. He balanced athletes, and he balanced Dave and Shane. So he was a big part of the whole thing. And there were a lot of key athletes: Jamie Staff, Chris Hoy, Victoria, Bradley, when Bradley wanted to admit it. All were, you know, working with Steve on quite a strong basis. He was a huge part of the whole part, and that was the thing about that time. There were a lot of great people who worked really well together for a period of time. So often this is the way, and I've seen it happen in Australia prior to that, where we've had a really successful games. The teamwork has been superb. We've all been focused on the same goal, same win, same ambition, and we've functioned really well. And then a bit of success comes, and what do human beings do? They disband. They want their own piece of something. It gets, you know, I'm probably a big part of that. And then you move on, you create a new team. And this about 4-year cycle, whether it's because the Olympics are every 4 years, or whether it's just because that's about how long human beings can work really well together with focused, strategic, targeted work. That, you know, it got to the end of that and we had this really successful games, and then all of a sudden it just started to get a bit rocky after that. I sort of moved, Chris moved on, things were a little bit different, and it's, yeah, it changes over time, and unless people like Track Record can come in and support that, then
we'll come on to, Scott, we'll come on to Track Record. You plugged your company 3 times already. Richard's going to
has it been 3? I only thought it was 2.
We agreed 3. Okay. Richard's
I don't think we made any agreement on that. Anyway,
Richard's going to hit you with some quick fire. Richard, go for it.
All right.
Yeah, Scott, what do you ride now? What bike do you ride?
Me,
Yeah.
I'm on an Oro.
An Oro.
All British.
And what's the best bike you've ever ridden?
Oh, my Beta 480 TT Enduro. Yeah, it's got a ton of horsepower. It's much better than an e-bike, I can tell you.
And what's your dream bike?
Oh, my dream bike. You know what? I don't dream about bikes, but I'm probably at the moment I'm up on a specialized stump jumper or something to get up around here in the mountain bike trails. I'm transitioning. There's a few roads here, and Richie Port trains well around here. There's a lot of hills, and these mountain bike trails are amazing. So I'm transitioning to the bush. What's
your cycling highlight?
Finishing. Well, I'm going to say finishing the Marmotte.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had to stop on Alpe d'Huez twice after waiting for my mate on top of Galibier. I cooled down too much, and Alpe d'Huez was hard after that. And yeah, but I finished it.
Is that your hardest day on a bike?
That's my hardest day on a bike. I ate poorly. I spewed. It was both ends that day, and it was pretty horrible. Thinking I'd come to it quite well after the Étape the previous year, where I was stomping on the final climb, top 10% on the final climb. Then it was a horrible day. Sports scientists got their nutrition wrong. I listened to Tim Kerrison at Ineos, and he gave me a bum steer.
We've got this question's been adapted over the webinars, and it's now, when will you get an e-bike?
When?
Yes.
When I run out of fuel on my motorbike. No, I'm very close. I'm not far away. Like that's what I'm thinking of for the downhill trails and stuff around here at the moment. So, but it'll be a mountain bike. It won't be a road bike.
And who's your cycling hero?
Oh, Sam Willoughby. Do you know who Sam Willoughby is? Sam Willoughby was Australian BMX rider, Olympic silver medalist, the most winningest, if that is such a word, BMX rider of all time. And Sam, after the last Olympics, had a really simple training accident, came off his bike, ended up in a wheelchair, and now he coaches his wife, who is Elise Willoughby, #1 BMX rider on the planet. She's in line for the Olympics to win. She's a world champion at the moment, and I do a bit of work with Sam and Elise, having been through coaching your wife to an Olympic Games. I've got a bit of experience to that, and he's a legend.
We'll look out for that name, but we've got a question coming from David Sachs, which is, which sports person would you most like to work with? And consequently, of course, which sport?
Ooh, which sports person, which sport? This is tricky. I would love to make a real change in football. Like, I would really, it's hard to make a full thing on this. I believe that if you worked with a leadership team in a football club, that if you actually got chairmans and sports science and managers and everyone on the same page, so Jurgen Klopp or someone like that would be quite fun. I think it'd be difficult, but it'd be fun.
Do you think talent comes before coaching or coaching before talent?
The talent one is wide, it's broad, and it's in, tactical, technical, physiological, psychological areas. I believe that physical talent in junior athletes comes quickly, but that doesn't necessarily mean the athlete is talented enough. So we see a lot in cycling, certainly, where junior world champions are crowned, yet they burn or are done before they make it to the top of sport. So they're talented physically, but they're not necessarily challenged or coached well on the psychological aspects when they're young, to allow them to make it to the top. So it tends to be that physical talent comes early, coaching then is required at that age to support the nurture of the athlete better. That's
interesting. For those on the webinar, we had Yanto Barker last week, and he was the British champion at under 17, and got onto the professional circuit. And his words, it was a grind. There was something missing between being a very talented under 20-year-old and then life in the fast lane, in the real world, and that came out loud and clear last week.
Developing that ability to think for yourself. Our systems are so good in so many areas now in developing, but that's a fast track, and it doesn't actually develop the round athlete. Like I'm saying, Chris Hoy was creating his own training program. He tried he didn't win a thing till he was about 28. And now we're pushing these kids at the age of 20 to be winning Olympic champions. And it's can we just have a look at this? If you imagine if you had the brain you have now when you had the body it's like, let's work through that whole coaching talent area, being more patient. And of course we're not, because we've only got finite funds for a certain period of time to move through, and we're maybe not as patient as we need to be, to create what I'll say real champions who are role models, who can think for themselves, who are, I'm going to go track record again here, Chris. We find it very hard to bring athletes out of sport who can coach, who are not just thinking about themselves, who are thinking about the person that they're coaching and developing them. It's really hard to find people coming out of sport who are interested in that.
Yeah. Top coaching tip, Scott.
Top coaching tip: ask questions, open ones.
Yeah. So here's a question for you then. On the basis that for one of the attendees it's currently snowing, so they're obviously not manning up and going outside, plus it's getting dark here.
It's clearly not 4 a.m. where they are, is it?
Yeah,
sorry.
No. What's your advice for frequency and duration of indoor turbo training? Long frequency and steady, or short and hard?
Oh, someone's reading the HIIT literature or hearing all the stuff about high intensity training. All right. Good. So same answer that you would always give to people. It's like, what do you want to achieve? Where are you trying to get to? And, make it really clear on where you're trying to get to. And then a combination of both is usually the best way to get there. If you've got a short amount of time, then a bit of HIIT training is a really good, quick way to do it. We did a big study back in about 2005 with the Australian Institute of Sport Riders. Now I say we did, I was a research assistant on that. That was Dr. Dave Martin, Australian Institute of Sport. And we did this whole project with the Tour Down Under, which was a fairly big race, is now, but was developing then. We studied all the power profiles of all the Australian under 23 athletes back then who did it. And then off the back of that, for the we then did rest recovery ratios, how long are each, little sprints, how long sustained power, all that. And then we combined it all and did a whole lab-based HIIT program the following year. And these guys were really good, but they couldn't finish the stages. When you combined it all and did the HIIT training, if you just did, they still did the volume, but yeah, so you need a combination of both to be able to finish long stages.
So there you go, you heard it here. So I've got a couple of
It's a good way to do some things quickly. You need a good amount of threshold training if you're going to do things well.
Yeah.
So do it.
Couple of quick anecdotal things, Scott, and then we're going to let you talk about track record. Okay, so it's the quid pro quo. So
I don't need to talk about track record anymore. I think I have talked about track record.
5.
I've got a couple of questions just to run the clock down.
Bolivia. Talk to us about Bolivia. Chris Hoy. Why didn't he get the standing kilo?
Oh, gutted. So for those who don't know, back in 2005, I was asked to go to Bolivia with who wasn't Sir Chris at the time, who was Mr. Chris Hoy back then. And that was a self-funded thing from Chris to go and break the world record after Arnaud Tourneau had been there, French rider had been there a few years earlier. I think it was on BBC Scotland. If you want to try and find it, it is on YouTube somewhere, I think, the whole thing. Just quite fun. It's still in 4x3 or something. Like it was prior to 16x9 stuff, which was just good. The weather conditions weren't favourable. We went for a morning, it wasn't warm enough. And we know it's about, you probably had Dan give you all these stats over the thing, but, about 1/10 of a second per kilo per degree. And he missed it by 5,000ths of a second. And he went, and it was about 9 degrees when he went for it. So if he'd had another 3 or 4 degrees, he would have broken that record. But that's the easy answer. The other is the performance, performance planning that we did wasn't quite up to scratch. There were some areas from skin suits to wheels to spacker filling the track to gear ratio wasn't high enough to like lots of things that we've learned since that were where that could have come from. And I think I've said before, it took 2 debriefs after that for us to be, well, certainly for me to be fairly comfortable with the fact that we'd made some decisions that could have been better at the same time as Chris was well over it straight away and moving on to his next big challenge, which was winning 3 Olympic gold medals, which he did quite successfully. So, but it was a fascinating thing to be a part of, like one of the greatest things in my life. It was just
to go that far and miss it by that much. I mean, it's just...
He broke a 500 flying record while we were there. So he smashed that. Funnily enough, the wind that the locals said was going to get up at 11 o'clock in the morning didn't get up, and it was a glorious day that afternoon that he got up and did the 500 fly. Like if we'd actually gone for the kilo, if he'd felt like he could have, he probably would have smashed that as well at that point. So yeah, listening to locals, conventional wisdom, all that sort of stuff doesn't always, you need a combination of both.
So you have a picture of skiing behind you. Talk to us about your 30 seconds on your skiing experience. Who taught you?
Oh, Konrad Bartelski, the legend himself. He was the biggest one. Focus on breathing and head position, which is fascinating. Just look up and breathe and your legs will follow. And then I was taking on Damon Hill down Verbier slopes. It was one of the most surreal and fantastic experiences of my life, other than Bolivia, or in combination with Bolivia. Yeah. So if Conrad is out there, he is a legend and just such a good coach. Really enjoyed a week skiing with Conrad a few years back.
Watching from the outside, or not, in Malaysia now, where you're training your current athlete. Do you think the medal table is directly proportional to the level of investment put into that sport?
Such a good question, Richard. Yes and no. Like all these things, they're all yes and no.
Yep.
Yeah, certainly, I think if you look at it from a big macro level, you'll look at funds invested into sport equals medals. I think Olympic sport, but I think it's all sport. Just look at football. Look at I'm pretty sure it's fairly.
Well, don't look at English rugby. That's the one place not to look, perhaps.
Oh, don't get me started on rugby.
Don't
get me started. I was a fan of the previous regime. I think it's out there. I think one of my good mates, David Mott, might be listening to this podcast. We've had this one in the living room before. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the coaching that was being developed in the previous regime, as much as the English rugby coach is Tasmanian too, Chris. Yeah, don't tell anyone that he's from the northwest coast of Tasmania.
Okay.
But I and not that it's not developing, and not that there's not fantastic people in there. I just brought Simon Amor over from the Rugby Sevens program, and Simon's a fantastic coach and developing in all sorts of ways. So I hope English rugby can go on. There's a great podcast on at the moment about the Australian rugby team and where all the money went. Have you followed that? I can't remember what that is, and where Australian rugby's gone. It's gone way further down in public views and perceptions than English rugby. So it's an interesting time for the game, that's for sure.
We're coming to the close. I know we could go on for a long time. I've got one last question, which, going way back, probably about 45 minutes ago, there was the stick and carrot. And I've always wondered whether Olympic coaches are financially incentivized as a result of their athletes. So if they medal, do you get a bonus? And does that therefore become a potential problem?
So it's lottery funding. It's basically government funding. There are no, that I'm aware of, incentives. That doesn't mean that before the more rigorous lottery funding processes that in previous periods, other performance directors might not have done things a little bit differently. I think that ways to incentivize the process and improving the process. I'm not a big fan of incentivizing the outcomes. It's a good conversation to have, I think, in terms of, GB was ahead, it was funded better, it had more resources and was ahead for a couple of campaigns there. Other countries are now, Australia is even catching up on salaries in other places where Australia was quite behind before. After Australia was ahead in Sydney, and then GB then went miles ahead with the lottery funding and the processes that came in place. And now, for me in Asia or other places, it's even improved, and we'll see how that goes over time.
Brilliant. Conscious we are ticking past what is 8 o'clock in the evening here. So an initial thank you to Dr. Scott Gardner. You've hung in there brilliantly, given the time in the morning. So
I'm only just getting going. Like, if this is a real pub chat,
it's not coffee in there.
We're not even a pint in, boys.
It's not even coffee in that. Richard, what's happening with the draw? Do you know?
Yeah, Gemma's done the draw. Anne Clark, congratulations. She'll be sporting some Lecole socks. And Tom Wright will make contact to
very good,
to get some socks posted out to you. So great. Thanks very much, Scott. I've enjoyed that, and an insight into elite sports coaching.
I'm not sure we're going to persuade Scott to come and join us on the up and coming rides, Richard, but you mentioned them at the start. Do you want to just remind people of the dates and how they can sign up?
We've got 3 dates. Well, we've got a whole calendar about to be published on the website. 20th of May, Thursday, Dunsfold near Godalming. Very informal, but we'll go and have a picnic there, about a 40-mile ride and a social group and a sports group. Then the 24th of June out of Essendon in Hertfordshire, and then the 22nd of July out of Mannings Heath Golf Club in Sussex. And there are other dates in the diary, but do come and join us for rides, and we'll follow COVID guidelines, whatever they might be at the time.
And we've got another webinar coming up, haven't we, on the 13th, which is going to be a tough act to follow after Scott this evening.
It is. Rob Wakefield, who runs a coaching business called BDOVELO, is a former hedge fund manager, or certainly involved in hedge funds, and he's, as they say, pivoted into cycling, and is going to share with us some tips. And we've given him a case study of really a fairly competent rider, but moving up to a challenging 100-mile sportive in a couple of months' time, 3 months' time. You know, what sort of training program should you be following?
Oh, there's your high intensity interval question. Bring that one back into that.
Yeah, it'll be there. Don't worry.
There'll be a lot of data and a lot of tech, I'm sure. But we'll see.
You might want to come back for that one, Scott. What do you reckon?
I might. Am I invited?
You're always invited. You're always invited.
Here you go. I'm a sports scientist here, and I didn't give you an ounce of data. Nothing
terrible.
to support any theory that I've got.
I think the only number I heard you mention was a 9-hole pitch and putt golf course.
Yeah, it was.
Look, absolutely brilliant, and sure we all really appreciate you getting up at God knows what time this morning to prep your hair and sort yourself out. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everybody on the webinar. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this evening, and look forward to catching up with you at the next event. Take care. Look after yourself. Good night.
Good night, everyone.